You're listening to continuing coverage in the suitcase murder, the trial of Sarah Boone, from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Now, back to the courtroom.
I'm going to go to court and I'm going to tell the judge, listen, my fiance has nothing to do with this. It's all my fault. We were both drinking and got out of hand. It's an isolated situation. It has never happened before. I love my fiance. She's a good woman. For being in trouble in her life, she has a 7-year-old son that she loves and cherishes.
A blind Boston Terrier.
She has 2 dogs. One is blind, one is deaf. She goes around and she's driving and sees an animal that's injured. She'll stop in the middle of the street, no matter what kind of traffic it is, just to make sure that that animal doesn't get injured any more than what it already has. We both love each other. We both live together. Yes. Every relationship has their arguments, but we are not the type of people that you guys are portraying us to be.
She especially.
Especially her. So please, if you can,
dismiss
this case.
Closed.
Drop it. She is not the type of person.
Good person.
She's a great person.
Angel.
I know she'd be an angel. She's close to it.
Best thing that has ever happened to you.
Yes, ma'am. And I love you to death. And I hate that we're going through this right now.
Sonnet.
What?
And they good.
And you're good. I love you, baby. Whatever you want me to say. God will prevail, and He will take us out of this situation.
Clearly, Jorge Torres is dominating the defendant. Clearly, Jorge Torres is the one telling the defendant what to do. Clearly, Jorge Torres is the one calling the shots at 4748 France Lane. Ladies and gentlemen, are we so sure that Jorge Torres wasn't the person suffering from battered spouse syndrome? Next, we're going to come to the justifiable use of non-deadly force. The language and the arguments are pretty close to what we've already heard in the deadly force instruction, including the key language that it requires a reasonably cautious and prudent person under the same circumstances would have believed the use of non-deadly force was necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that this was not a case of non-deadly force. Jorge Torres lost his life as a result of these actions. We have heard the testimony of Dr. Sarah Zadovich, who described his cause and manner of death, who described the mechanism of death, how that oxygen dissipated in that suitcase. And when we also look at the imminency, we heard in opening statements by Mr. Owens that, the big threat in this case, the awful threat, was in the magic 9 minutes between the video at 11:12 that she took, torturing Jorge Torres, to her follow-up video at 11:23, after she had moved the suitcase. Mr. J, you published from States 17, IMG 1063. It was a short video. Well, what's one of the things that we notice by this point? You can hear how loud George's voice is on the 11:12 video. But now, roughly 11 minutes later from the time that started, we see that the makeshift coffin that he's in has been moved, and his voice now is softer. The life is draining from Jorge Torres, and it's evident in that video. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence that there was no threat in the magic 9 minutes that was not recorded. There was only Jorge Torres in this box, slowly being killed. Next, we come to weighing the evidence. This instruction tells us it is up to you to decide what evidence is reliable. You should use your common sense in deciding which is the best evidence and which evidence should not be relied upon in considering your verdict. You may find some of the evidence not reliable or less reliable than other evidence. You should consider how the witness acted as well as what they said. Some things you should consider. Did the witness have an opportunity to see and know the things about which the witness testified? In focusing on the defendant, absolutely. Two people walked through the front door on the evening of February 23rd, 2020 at 4748 France Court. Jorge Torres and Sarah Boone. But only Sarah Boone ever walked out that front door alive. Did the witness seem to have an accurate memory? This is an emphatic no. And the litany of her intoxication in versions of events is evidence of that. Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering the attorney's questions? I would submit to you she wasn't. 4, did the witness have some interest in how the case should be decided? Clearly. Does the witness's testimony agree with the other testimony and other evidence in the case? And I would say largely no. Because on the issue of whether or not Jorge Torres could have threatened her the way she says that he did, the answer is clearly no, and we know that from the forensic data. We know that from the items itself. Did the witness at some other time make a statement that is inconsistent with the testimony he or she gave in court? In regards to the defendant, it's almost more appropriate to ask about the time she did make a consistent statement. You listen to her version of events on the 911 call, on the body cameras, on her first interviews with law enforcement, and then you hear her in her next interview the next day with Detective Copsell and Detective Lowen, and more details come out. Things change. First, she was never intoxicated, then she was intoxicated. Then there's just the whole fact of she omits the fact of, oh yeah, he was actually trying to attack me. Oh yeah, I was in fear for my life. When she said at every turn, no, it was just a great day. We were having fun. Oh my God, I can't believe this. We were doing good. The only stress we had was about jobs. And now, 4.5 years after the fact, it's time to come up with a new story. But ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the truth does not change. The facts do not change. The videos do not change. And on any version of events that the defendant has given, they all add up to the fact that there is absolutely no doubt that she is guilty of murder. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, do you have any doubt about the defendant's guilt when she described using that baseball bat to hit Jorge Torres's fingers back in the suitcase when he attempted to save his life? Do you have any doubt when she is given how many versions of events in this case? Do you have any doubt after hearing the testimony of her neighbors about the loud crash and the arguing that night? Do you have any doubt after hearing the testimony of Dr. Sarah Zadovich? Do you have any doubt after watching the videos of Jorge Torres being murdered and her laughing about it and talking about the fact that he cheated on her? Do you have any doubt after reading the text messages from her phone? After seeing the videos of how she controlled and manipulated Jorge Torres? And if you say, Mr. Cacciatore, I still have a doubt. Well, then the law asks you, is that doubt to an element? And is that doubt a mere possible doubt, a speculative, an imaginary, or a forced doubt? I submit to you the idea that she had to do this because she was a battered spouse is an imaginary doubt. It's a doubt born from the imagination of Sarah Boone. It is not a reasonable doubt. But if you find yourself back in that deliberation room and you are just trying to think of some way in which the defendant is not guilty, just searching, struggling for that way, that also is not a reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. That is a forced doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm confident that when you read the entirety of those jury instructions and apply the law to the facts that came out in this case, that you are going to come back with the only lawful verdict, which is guilty as charged, second-degree murder. Thank you.
Members of the jury, it is 4:04. As I promised, we were going to take that afternoon break before the defense proceeds with their closing argument. You're going to leave everything behind. Similar instruction that I've given you before. Please don't conduct any independent investigation, research as to the person, places, thing, or charge involved in this case. And do not have any discussions among yourselves or anyone else. We'll bring it back in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
All rise. Jury exited.
Y'all may be seated. Thank you.
Judge, I've got a motion.
Okay, may proceed.
Sarah Boone's entitled to a fair trial. I think that right's been compromised here today. I don't know who's scheduled to put the two detectives on the front row with the Torres family, the family of the victim. But they had to have known to tell them that the suitcase video, which has been around for 4.5 years, was going to be played during opening statement. And the state attorney's office or the sheriff's department had to advise them, or the victim's advocate had to advise them, that if they couldn't take it in front of a jury that's trying to decide the case, they needed to get out of the courtroom. Now, what happened here today should not ever happen. There should be safeguards in place. There's no room for this after 2 weeks of a murder trial for something like that to happen. One of the Torres members of the family audibly, during the 2-minute suitcase video, expressed some kind of emotional reaction. I look back, he or she were bent over in agony, physical pain. The physical pain followed the audible announcement. You can't unring that bell. That's their responsibility to ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen, especially when they know they're going to show a video and the family of the victim is on the front row. I've never heard of such. I asked for a mistrial.
Response.
I've never heard of such a request. The victim's family has a right to be here. They were advised as to what will be used during closing arguments. I cannot make a decision for the victim's family and the homicide survivors as to whether or not they believe they can handle it. She clearly, or he, I don't know, couldn't, and I believe the appropriate thing was done. They left the courtroom. But again, to say this is intentional sabotage and all the accusations that continuously get made are unsubstantiated. And it does not warrant a mistrial. People get warned, and sometimes they misjudge their own emotions. I don't understand what test we are expected to run on homicide survivors. So the motion should be denied.
Motion's denied. Jury's going to be back in about 13 minutes, Counselor. So we'll reconvene at that point in time.
Could the state put the suitcase back in the water?
Yeah, could we clean the well from the state's materials, please? Thank you. We are back on the record, 2020 CF 2603, State of Florida versus Sarah Boone. State appearances for the record.
Dave Ketchner on behalf of the state. William J. for the Florida, State of Florida.
James Owens for Sarah Boone.
Kevin Beck on behalf of Sarah Boone.
Tony Henderson, Sarah Boone.
Ms. Boone is still seated at counsel's table wearing the same clothing from this morning. Are we ready to bring in our jury for the defense closing at this time? State.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense.
Judge, I would like you to give the audience an instruction, and then if you would, instruct the state attorney to instruct whatever family members or friends of Jorge Torres may not be in here and may not be able to hear the instruction, but may come in during the trial so that we can try to get some order.
Are there any other members of Mr. Torres' family that may be outside that may be joining us? Okay, all right, so she's left, she's no longer here? Okay, that's what I just asked. Is there anyone outside? Okay.
Yeah, she's outside, but she's not coming back in.
Okay, all right. So, members of our gallery, good afternoon. I'm going to please ask you to please contain yourself and not to have any emotional outbursts. We had a minor one, and the person, whoever it was, had a small outburst, then hid next to another family member, and then excused herself during the last during the closing. It seemed to be minor in nature. However, I'm advising everyone that at this time, if you believe that you cannot control yourself or your emotional responses during the defense's closing argument or any rebuttal by the state, I'm going to politely ask you to excuse yourselves at this time. All right, thank you very much. Mr. Owens, anything else, sir?
No, sir.
All right, state.
We're ready.
All right, let's bring back in our panel.
They're making their selections.
Okay, thank you. All can be seated. They're making their dinner selections. We'll just give them a couple minutes to do that. Thank you.
William J.
Okay.
I was just, I don't know if that is allowed by the court or.
Anything?
Been allowed since I started practicing in 1997.
If you want to split up your closing between the two of y'all, that's fine by me.
Well, I intended on doing the closing, but when I finish, Mr. Henderson wants to say something. I may ask him to.
I've never seen it done that way. I've understood the sandwich can't be broken. I've never, ever seen a single closing argument split by another attorney.
If it's a discretionary issue, I'll leave it up to you, sir, on what you want to do and how you want to present your closing.
Object during rebuttal.
Reasonable. Who would be objecting during rebuttal?
Mr. Owens.
Okay, there you go.
Henry.
State, do you recognize our jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense, do you recognize our jury? Thank you. Y'all may be seated. Members of the jury, for one of the last times, if you could, please raise your hands to confirm that you complied with the court's instructions. All hands have been raised. Members of the jury, at this time, the defense is going to proceed with their closing argument. Similar to the state's closing argument, these are not evidence, these are just arguments, and I ask you to pay attention to them. Thank you. Mr. Owens, you may proceed, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Y'all know me, I'm James Owens, along with Tony Henderson and the girls. We're all from Milton. I think y'all figured that out, that we were from out of town. Santa Rosa County, it's northwest Florida, close to Pensacola. And my buddy Kevin Beck, he's a longtime friend, he's from New Mexico. The team, the defense team, is here, and we're here to represent Miss Sarah Boone. And we feel confident that we're going to be able to show you why she's not guilty. Okay? And I'm going to take my time. I've got some notes. I'm not the most organized person in the world. I've got some exhibits that we're going to show you. And then we got a couple of videos at the end, okay? And we're going to try our best to help you make the right decision, okay? But yeah, Milton's a small town.
Objection. Providence.
Overruled.
I'll tell you how small it is. 7 miles away is another small town called Pace. In between that is a Walmart. It's a very small town. We didn't know what to expect coming down here to Orlando.
Providence.
Judge, I'm allowed to...
I'll give you a little bit more for intro, but then we need to get into it.
I'm going to get into it, but I wanted to say, it's a small town, good people. We've been down here 3 weeks. We didn't know what to expect. We've been surprised. From
Objection. Improper argument.
Mr. Owens, approach. Objection's overruled.
all I wanted to say is just, since we've been here, we've been treated with respect and hospitality, and just like we've been at home. We appreciate that. Now, I'm going to do some reading, and then I'm going to do some talking. But Ultimately, this is about justifiable use of force. That is a legal defense in Florida. We as citizens, the law is designed to protect us from defending ourselves, to protect us from potential attack. And you are the only ones, in this case, because Sarah Boone was arrested, that's going to be able to look at it critically and objectively. Objectively. Not like the state attorney.
Objection to proper argument.
Overruled.
Objectively. And the law in Florida gives y'all the power and authority to do that. The state attorney can't make the decision. They can't make the decision. They can try to influence you. And we're going to talk about some of the things they did here in this trial. And some of the things they said.
Objection. Objection. Can we motion?
Yes. You may proceed. Objection's overruled.
Thank you, Judge. They've got their side, their position, we've got our side. So we're going to talk about that. But, and we're going to talk about justifiable use of deadly force and non-deadly force, but either way, however you rule, it still justifies her behavior, and the result is not good. Now, I don't believe there's anybody...
Objection to proper argument.
Overruled.
Objection to reproach.
Yes.
I think you will find from considering the evidence in this case that there is no doubt that Sarah Boone is a victim. That Sarah Boone has been traumatized. That Sarah Boone is still traumatized. And the reason for the trauma is Jorge Torres. The reason for the trauma is Jorge Torres. From the positive things about the man that we've seen on video, to the positive things Sarah Boone has testified about, to the violent monster he becomes. And I mean monster, because it was repeatedly. And what happens the next day? Man, I don't remember. I was drunk. I don't remember. That's the gaslighting. That this young woman, vulnerable woman, with nobody, just starving for love, starving for attention, and seeing the good in the man. And it was good. But every day was on the balance. She measured every day, depending on how it started and then how it ended. And that's the way she had to live her life. Day in and day out. Day in and day out. Dr. Harper and Dr. Brandon talked about trauma. Dr. Harper spoke of the veterans that she had treated for post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know if you remember her testimony, but she spoke about some of the veterans that had been in the war in Iraq, and people in war a lot of times get post-traumatic stress. It used to be called shell shock and other things. But people in wartime, or police officers, police officers will get post-traumatic stress. And a lot of them come in, the males come in with this bravado, I'm all right. I'm all right. And so, that's why Dr. Harper was talking about the veterans, that's what they'll do. But you got to spend time with them. It just can't be one session. And you've got to run post-traumatic stress testing, which tells whether they really have post-traumatic stress. And we all probably have experienced some trauma. All of us have lost some loved ones. And it's awful. You're in shock. You can't believe it. It's disbelief. You don't sleep for days. And eventually, you have to go back to work. You take a week off. Life has to go on. Life has to go on. You go back to work. Kids are in school. You get a little time. Right? Time heals. Right? These veterans that come back from a deployment, they get back, they get some semblance of normalcy. They may or may not get some treatment, but time helps. Time heals. Everybody, it helps. Just time. Overcoming a divorce, overcoming a death, whatever trauma. Sarah Boone had no break. No break. Learned helplessness. Just giving up. Just giving up. I can't get out of this situation. They broke up. She'd go about 2 days. She'd go about 2 days. Texting and calling. Just learned helplessness. And it's, in the manual. Battered spouse syndrome is not, but what did you hear Dr. Harper say? She suffers from post-traumatic stress. That is a mental disorder. You are actually undergoing the psychological effects of post-traumatic stress. You're not in your right mind. And it's repeating itself. It's repeating itself again and again, day in and day out. And when you look at this law, that's what you have to apply. Someone in Sarah Boone's shoes, when you're deciding whether her conduct was reasonable. Got a bunch of notes. Not that, it was something I wanted to read. Where did I put it? Sarah Boone's long-term exposure to abuse created a state of learned helplessness and diminished her capacity to assess risk, especially in moments of heightened stress. The cyclical nature of this violence, the tension building, the battering, the contrition phases, caused Sarah to be trapped psychologically in that relationship. Due to this clear abuse, Sarah Boone had a reasonable belief of imminent harm under her state of mind. Jorge Torres had a history of violence against Sarah, and as a result, Sarah Boone's actions were the result of fear conditioned by abuse she endured over time. The cumulative effects of long-term abuse, as we saw her behavior on the 2-minute suitcase video, is a trauma response. Sarah Boone acted out of a sense of preservation. While tragic, it was not driven by malice, but a mind ravaged by abuse. And I'm going to ask you to try to understand. Try to understand. Sarah Boone, being emotionally and psychologically broken, whose actions may have been misguided attempts at survival but not murder. Imminent danger, her response reacted to that belief. It's somebody suffering from the long-term psychological effects of domestic violence. Who spent a lot of time? Dr. Brandon, you remember him. He was the first expert on trauma. Took some notes. Kevin Beck, you remember, did the direct examination of Dr. Brandon. He was from down in Miami, I think. He talked about the trauma, that you cannot escape from the abuse, so you develop coping skills to protect yourself, knowing that the bad things will happen to me. It changes your behavior, not only your behavior, but your thinking. Your subjective thinking about fear and what to do. And if you remember, Dr. Brandon said it's all about that person's perception. Okay? A lot of times they will self-medicate with alcohol or drugs. A lot of times they suffer from anxiety. Basically, he said the trauma ends up being terror because you do not know what to expect. You do not know what is going to happen that night. It may be a great night. You may drink, and both of you have a great time. He falls asleep, passes out, you fall asleep, passes out. But it may turn, depending on his mood, I don't know if you can tell, she would try to placate him. Dr. Brandon said, you know, when you're trying to evaluate somebody, it takes time to get them to trust you. And the ultimate goal, he said, is to be a behavioral detective. If you're a forensic psychologist, is to be a behavioral detective. And the ultimate goal is to put yourself in the abused person's eyes so you can better understand their world. But ultimately, it's their perception of danger. Their perception of danger is what you have to look at. What a reasonable person would do under their perception of danger. Now, I want to go on. Trauma experts explain how victims' reactions in moments of stress are the product of the damaged psyche. Her actions, although tragic, and it was a tragedy, Jorge Torres lost his life in that suitcase. It's a reactionary response to sustained trauma. It's as if Sarah was acting out of a deeply ingrained fear and helplessness developed over the years. So it's a desperate need for survival, but battered women do things to keep the peace from time to time. And when they feel like they have a small portion of momentary power, they may enjoy that by vocalizing their position to the abuser. Sarah Boone's not perfect. Sarah Boone would argue with him, talk down to him. Some would say was somewhat abusive to him. Sarah's not charged with that. Sarah Boone is not charged with that. And I want to read you something on that subject. Essentially, Okay, I don't know where it's at, but I'm going to have to come back to it. But essentially what it said was, eventually, here it is. It's been a 2-week trial. I got a bunch of notes. I'm trying to get this right. I know it's important. What I wanted to say was someone can be mean and angry and hateful and intoxicated and still be abused. They're not mutually exclusive. And mutual abuse exists where one is abusive towards another. And eventually the victim, Sarah Boone, trying to fight back against the abuse, became verbally abusive. While the victim has committed verbal abuse, it is important to remember that they, Sarah Boone, are the victim and have been pulled into an extremely vicious cycle where they are trying to survive. Sarah Boone intentionally left Jorge Torres in the suitcase, which was the act of a battered spouse syndrome woman. She went up to her room, she fell asleep or passed out. These actions are disconnected. Ultimately, she didn't let him out because of her fear that she knew if he got out in that moment, what he would do. That's real fear, that's real trauma that she was experiencing at that time. Now, I talked to you about force being used, and I think I talked to you about blocking an attack using a physical restraint like the suitcase to block somebody's attack. And the example I give, I got a couple of examples that may or may not apply. Let's say you're in a bar and you got your buddies and the other guy's got their buddies and they're drinking and it ends up being an argument between two of them. And you realize that these two are fixing to get in it. Well, one of your buddies comes around on the other side and grabs the guy before he's able to strike him, right? So you're committing an offense on this guy, but it's a restraint. It's a restraint where you grab him by the neck and try to get him out the bar. So yeah, you're committing an act, but it's designed to defend another, which is legal. Or let's say you have a situation where you have a police officer and he's on patrol. You know, he's in uniform, he's wearing a firearm, and of course he's got the bulletproof vest. And he goes to a call where there's a suspect that may be armed. A suspect that may be armed. And so he gets there, he gets out of the squad car, he's walking around. Of course, he's taking out his gun because he realizes he may be armed. And eventually he sees the suspect, and the suspect reaches for his waist. Now, in that moment in time, that officer has to make a decision. Am I going home with my family tonight? And I asked Dr. Werner about this Vaseline thing, it's called fear response or fight or flight. You know, those decisions are made, it's instinctive based on your set of circumstances. She instinctively reacted to her unique set of circumstances to save her life or save herself from another one of these. I'm 63. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that. Her father's not around. talk about the case a little bit. And if you'll remember, I'll get back here. If you'll remember, lost my place a little bit. Let's start with the witnesses, and then I'll talk about Sarah. But the first witness out of the box for the state, if you remember, was Juan Torres, the brother. Remember that? It was some time ago. I know it's been a while. Y'all taking notes. You may have to go back. Their first witness was a good witness for us. Their first witness in their prosecution of Sarah Boone for murder was a good witness for us. Remember Tony Henderson did the cross-examine of Juan Torres. Asked him, what did you hear Sarah Boone say? Juan Torres, she was yelling, he's been choking me. He's been choking me. Mr. Henderson said, did that surprise you? Juan Torres said, no. That family knew what was going on. The police knew what was going on. The neighbors knew what was going on. Pearl Walker came in here, 80-something years old, in a wheelchair. Kevin Beck called her up. She saw it. Is there any doubt? Is there any doubt? I tell you why there's no doubt. In cross-examination, I got Dr. Warner to even admit. Did you hear it? Yes? Okay, Mr. Owens. She suffers from battered spouse syndrome. Wouldn't admit it on direct. Well, maybe. I don't really know. I hadn't had enough time to really see her. You hadn't seen the pictures? You hadn't seen the 2-minute video? You've seen her one time earlier this month. One time. And she's going to start testifying about stuff she's never said before until she showed up in court? About, well, based on what she told me, I don't think she was in imminent fear? Come on. This is a courtroom. This is a courtroom. Good thing y'all are here. We thank you. But it gets even worse than that. It gets even worse than that here in this courtroom. The state attorney referred to these pictures. And I was going to rise up and show these pictures to you.
Overruled. You may proceed.
And I was going to rise up and show these pictures to you. Well, yeah, I'm going to do that. They put her on trial for murder. But what did they say? And I got to turn to this. Make sure I get this exactly like they said it. I took a bunch of notes. Let me make sure I got this quote. find it, but it was something to the effect, maybe Jorge Torres is the battered spouse. Can you believe it? Can you believe that? Now you know why we're here. Now you know why we're here. Little boys learn early on that girls are different. You do not put your hands on a girl. You can't wrestle with them, you can't punch them, you can't kick them. You can't treat women that way. When you become adults, I don't care what she does to you. I don't care what she says to you. If she gets in your face, whatever she does, you do not have a right to hit a woman. No, sir. What has the state attorney tried to do?
Objection, proper argument.
Sustained.
What have they done?
Objection.
What evidence have they tried to put on?
Overruled.
What evidence have they tried to paint Sarah as? What evidence? Controlled and manipulated were the words they used. You know, this ain't the 1900s, this is 2024. What's all these text messages? Why is that relevant? What are they trying to claim? She provoked his violence? She provoked his violence. Isn't that what they've done here in this trial?
Proper argument.
Sustained.
I'm going to get back on this. Abraham Marino. I don't know if you remember him. Abraham Marino changed his statement. They took a statement from Abraham Marino in which Sarah stated, I don't know if you remember, but it was when the police were all there. I think they got the tape out, and some neighbors were coming around, and there were 2 or 3 neighbors sitting around. He said Sarah came out and stated it was an accident. Okay? Well, then, it was an accident. And this, Abraham Marino knew Jorge Torres from Philly. Okay? They were friends. They would talk either at the complex, or if Marino went to Hall's Ace Hardware, or Ace Hardware, what it was called. The state attorney notifies.
I'm going to object to reading from things that are not in evidence.
Approach. You may proceed.
So for 4.5 years, Marino says, all I heard Sarah say that afternoon was it was an accident. Then he came in here today, or this week, and said, no, she said I was teaching him a lesson, things got out of hand, and then I fell asleep. 4.5 years later, we know he's friends with the Torres. We heard it here. Now, I want to talk to you about the 2 boys that live right next door. You remember Vincent Battaglia, and Brandon Motes. Remember those guys? And you remember it came out in the testimony, this event happened on February 23rd of 2020. But it came out in the testimony that Sarah had said, Jorge Torres, the night before, February 22nd of 2020, grabbed me by my hair and pulled me down the stairs in my apartment from top to bottom, which is consistent with what they were saying happened, remember? But they got their dates wrong. And remember Mr. Henderson called Deputy Copsell, or Detective Copsell up in our case, and she had to say, yeah, I didn't take their two statements until the 27th, February the 27th, remember? So they're remembering back, and they both had similar stories. Of course, they had time to talk by then, the 27th. I think the only recorded interviews they got the night of this event, February 23rd, was from Sarah Boone and her ex-husband, Brian Boone, right? So they came back following up on the 27th. That's when they got a statement from Brandon Motes and Vincent Battaglia. And at that time, they said, yeah, we heard that sound.
More continuing coverage in the suitcase murder. The trial of Sarah Boone is on the way. From the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Press subscribe now.